Welcome to the HerHealth Podcast, transforming health for women and girls at risk, where we empower women and girls to take charge of their health and well-being. Join us as we shine a spotlight on issues affecting women and girls' health and explore ways to create positive change. Get ready to be inspired and empowered as we discuss health, advocacy, and empowerment for women and girls at risk. Please be advised that this podcast may cover sensitive topics such as gendered violence. We understand that these discussions can be difficult to listen to. If you feel uncomfortable or need support, we encourage you to prioritize your well-being. Consider exploring our other podcasts if these topics are triggering for you. Resources can be found in the description.
Welcome to today's episode of the HerHealth Podcast. We are so excited to have Kira Snodgrass and Mary Valenzuela with us from Calgary Communities Against Sexual Abuse, or CASA. Kira and Mary are both sexual violence educators and have an incredible wealth of experience in supporting survivors, as well as providing education on the complexities of sexual violence. Kira, with her background in child and youth care and addictions counseling, has worked on the sexual assault response team in both Lethbridge and Calgary, providing frontline support and education. Her deep passion for supporting people impacted by sexual violence comes through in everything she does. Mary comes with a background in sociology and women's and gender studies, and she's dedicated much of her work to creating safe spaces for vulnerable communities. Whether it's immigrant youth or youth in the justice system, Mary has been advocating for change through education and dialogue for years. Today, we're exploring sexual violence with an intimate partner relationship and how it's often overlooked, how consent is misunderstood in committed partnerships, and how trauma-informed and intersectional approaches can help us better support survivors. We'll also discuss the evolution of sexual assault laws in Canada and practical strategies for professionals, communities, and allies. Kira and Mary, welcome. To start us off, the question I have for you is, why do you think intimate partner sexual violence tends to be minimized or misunderstood, even among professionals?
Part of it can be that there's this traditional false idea that sexual violence can exist in the same relationship or even interaction that consensual sexual activity exists. Yeah, for some reason, there's kind of always been this idea or perspective that if you routinely engage in a sexual relationship consensually with someone, that consent just applies to any and all interactions you'll have with them, which we know, of course, is false. It can certainly happen in those relationships or those interactions. I think part of it is that, those, like I said, two things can exist at once. We can have consensual sexual interactions with someone and non-consensual. The two aren't mutually exclusive. I think additionally, though, there is a common idea of sexual violence or sexual assault specifically happening in the same way that we see it happen in movies or TV shows, but that's not usually how it plays out or occurs. I think we have to keep in mind that manipulating, guilting, or coercing someone into engaging in sexual activity is not true consent, meaning that it's not a consensual sexual interaction. And that's often the way that intimate partner sexual violence occurs. It's not typically in the fashion that we see it taking place specifically on movies and TV shows. And I think we had mentioned this too in our webinar session, is just for some people, they might be like, yeah, of course, consent needs to exist in relationships and every sexual interaction and everything like that. But then as soon as we bring up the manipulating, guilting, or coercing, it's like, oh, I didn't realize that was part of it. And so that, I think, is where some of that lack of connection takes place, where folks maybe don't understand or they even maybe minimize intimate partner sexual violence, is because we miss the piece of true consent.
Absolutely. And I find, and it's, I think, something we see throughout social discourse, that we really do assume a relationship is implied consent when it isn't. And it's always an ongoing thing, regardless of if you're in a relationship or not. Mm-hmm. And that leads me to my next question, that many people still believe that consent is automatically given in long-term or marital relationships. How do you address this myth in your education and support work?
Yeah. Well, we try and address it in a very delicate way, because there's a lot of different reasons why people hold this misconception as the truth, maybe even in their own lives, or that's just the way that they view relationships. But for some folks who grew up in or were like married prior to 1983, when laws did change to showcase that sexual violence can happen within marriages or common law partnerships, long-term relationships. I think that notion was also kind of passed down or just still held true by those who were married or being raised during that time. That can't happen within those marriage or common law partnerships. And another piece too is that for some folks, and we've had some really awesome individuals who have been very candid and open with us in our trainings, that within their cultural or religious backgrounds, they were told specifically that women, that it was their duty to engage in sexual acts with their husband, regardless of whether or not they wanted to. And so it's been normalized. And so with those kind of pieces in play, we want to make sure that we're very delicate with the way that we approach addressing this myth. So we do our best to hold that non-judgmental space for folks and let them know that we aren't shaming if this was a belief that is or was held by them, but instead it's an area for change and evolution in their thinking. So we really focus on providing that gentle guidance, kind of explaining the different nuances, even maybe using some non-sexual violence related examples, because we find that that can be something that's pretty effective for people to kind of take it from a less confusing perspective and apply it to sexual violence. And sometimes you can see that shift where it's a level of validation for maybe why they have felt violated or harmed in their own relationship from their partner. Yeah, so again, just holding a lot of space for that because it can bring out some realization for folks. And of course, it's a bit nuanced when we're talking about the reasons behind why some people might hold this myth or misconception, but that's just a bit of a general overview of how we've addressed it in the past and maybe how we can kind of continue to address it too, is in that really delicate, gentle way, knowing that there might be some personal hurt behind that too.
I love the metaphor of holding space, and I think we should do that a lot more for each other when we're dealing with vulnerable things.
Yeah.
I am curious that I know a lot of our viewership probably learns, or listenership, I suppose, learns a lot from both the podcast you've joined us on and the webinars that you've joined us on. And it sounds like a lot of your work is spent addressing myths.
Yeah.
Do you find that even sometimes maybe the simplest ways of explain or addressing those myths or holding space for those things tends to facilitate a lot of change for people?
I think so. And I think that change is a slowly evolving thing. I think people need to kind of mull it over. I think there's a natural defensiveness that comes up when something that we've held as truth is challenged or is kind of disproven. I think, and that's for anything in life, right? Not just topics like sexual violence. So I think that does inspire a level of change, but it just takes a while for folks to unpack. But being able to offer that like judgment-free space and like warm, welcoming space really does allow for people to unpack that in real time if they're comfortable.
Absolutely. And it's such important work too. When I think about addressing myths, one thing that comes to mind is like the legal sphere, because I know when you're talking about partner violence, family violence, sexual violence, myths transcend social into the legal sphere so often, be it laws, be it court processes.
Mm.
Can you share a little bit about how sexual assault laws in Canada have evolved, and where do you think they still fall short when it comes to survivors of intimate partnerships?
Prior to 1983 in Canada, marital sexual violence was not recognized. And additionally, laws really indicated that only a man could use sexual violence to harm a woman who was not his wife, was how it was specified. So the way that that law mentioned is that it would need to be a man who was causing harm, needed to be to a woman who was not his wife, and it actually outlined it as intercourse. So it implies that there needs to be penetration as well for it to be considered rape under the law at the time is what it would have been defined as. It's very interesting. It was so limiting. And now the laws really do reflect. So after 1983, the laws reflected that sexual assault could happen to anyone, by anyone, and can also happen within marriages. Additionally, the laws now encompass any unwanted sexual act. So not just limiting it to penetration. So I feel like in terms of where it maybe falls short, though, would be by not including the pieces around true consent doesn't really speak a lot to manipulation or coercion, especially how that can exist in intimate partner relationships, withholding intimacy, financial control, manipulation, guilting, and so forth. So I feel like that is maybe where it falls a bit short. One thing I'll say, and this was something that I mentioned in the webinar too, is that I've had conversations with individuals who think that the sexual assault laws in the criminal code are too broad. They're not very specific. They're a bit more open-ended. A reason why they're a bit more open-ended is because sexual assault specifically can look like a lot of different things. It doesn't necessarily look the same depending on the instances, and there's a lot of things that go into that. So by having a bit more of a broad definition means that we're not leaving out any experiences, whereas we saw prior to 1983, that very niche definition really left out a lot of folks. So I do think the education piece is needed for now to try and help folks understand how that intimate partner sexual violence can exist and how that shows up. And I think we mentioned as well in 2019, the criminal code did define what an intimate partner could be included as, so even including like prior partners, to provide a little bit more understanding to intimate partner violence as a whole. But again, it doesn't speak to kind of those nuances and how that can shake out in sexual assault specifically. So I do think that's where it could be changed a bit more to be a bit more comprehensive.
Such good points. And I know you speak to it when you speak to education, that there's what's written in the law and then there's how the law is applied or worked with. And so I think education is so instrumental in that.
For sure.
Now, in your work, I know that you see a lot in terms of intersection between domestic violence and sexual violence. How does that play out, and what should people understand about the overlap?
We had a Venn diagram up in the webinar that kind of showed that intersection of domestic violence and sexual violence, because they are their own two things, and then that intersection is where intimate partner sexual violence exists. And I think the use of economic or financial abuse, emotional abuse, intimidation, isolation, coercion, threats, they're all types of domestic violence. And we can see these same elements of domestic violence being used to enact sexual violence in that intimate partner relationship. So that's how we can see it play out in the intimate partner sexual violence or domestic violence situations. Though I think the biggest element of overlap when we're looking at sexual violence and domestic violence on their own as two separate crimes is that both are about power and control. Whether someone uses domestic violence or sexual violence to cause harm or using both, regardless of which one they're using or if they're using both at once, the motivation behind it is power and control. Power and control is the purpose, and in this case, domestic violence and sexual violence are just the tools used to exercise or gain that feeling of power and control. So that really is kind of the main point behind them, and that's where you see that overlap, is that they're both motivated by the same thing. They're just different tools used to achieve that.
In all your presentations so far, I've loved the diagrams that you have and the visuals you have, because it really helps actualize the problem. It's like back in the 90s when we started talking about power and control, and Jackie Campbell introduced the power and control wheel, and we started to really see how it works. Your work has expanded so much on that. I love it. Now, a lot of the things you talk about really speak to a trauma-informed approach, like person-centered, community-centered, holding space. So the question that comes to mind for me is, what does a trauma-informed approach really look like in practice when someone discloses intimate partner sexual violence? And with that in mind, what should professionals or even friends and family keep in mind?
I think that the most important thing that professionals or even friends and family should keep in mind when they're supporting someone who has experienced intimate partner sexual violence is to approach the person from a place free of judgment and their own biases. It's really helpful to always check in with yourself, to check your own biases so you don't bring that to the conversation. And people are able to hold space for the individual's experience with an open mind. Oftentimes, when a friend or a family member discloses to us that they are being abused by their partner, whether that's sexual or physical, emotional, mental, etc., our first instinct is always to tell them, usually that person is bad for you. They're gonna harm you even more, or like, you should come to my place, or I'll find a shelter for you. I'll just get out of that place, basically, right? And a lot of times that type of statements or support, they come from a place of concern for the well-being and the safety of the person, especially because we probably deeply care for that individual, right? However, when we use that type of support, not only are we injecting our judgment in that conversation, we're also taking more choice and power and control from that individual who have already lost so much power and control when they experience that abuse. And that can create a barrier to support as well. We might have the best intentions at heart, but that may impact the person that we're supporting differently, and that might stop them from seeking support from us, or seeking support at all, if they feel like leaving that relationship is something that they're not yet ready to do. This might also be us failing to recognize that there are also reasons that the person might be choosing to stay in that relationship. And even if we don't understand that, all those reasons are valid, right? We might not be able to fully grasp and make sense why someone who is being harmed is choosing to stay in that relationship, and they're choosing to move forward that way. But again, like I said a while ago, it is not our duty as supporters to make sense of that. As supporters, the most important thing that we can do for that individual is to provide that safe space for them to share their experience and ask them what they need in that moment, even if that means we'd have to do that multiple times with the same person. So really just providing that space for that individual, no matter how many times we'd have to do it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Something comes to mind is a conversation we had either last week or the week before, I can't remember, but sometimes when we respond to disclosures or try to support survivors who we know and care so deeply about, we get it wrong. Like, we don't follow trauma-informed principles, or we do respond from that place of judgment. Is there advice you can give folks who are listening about if they have gotten it quote unquote wrong, or if they feel like they haven't responded in the best way? What's a good way to help recover that and better support the people they care about?
I think being transparent would be a really great start to that. Obviously, we're human. We feel deep emotions, especially for people that we deeply care about. But being able to be transparent that I had that initial reaction because I was really concerned for your safety could be really helpful. But also leading from there, after being transparent with our initial reaction, leading with the proper type of support when we are able to like catch ourselves in that moment, and allowing for them to lead that conversation from then on, and providing the support with the key messages that we educate folks with. Like, I believe you, it's not your fault, I support your decisions, your feelings matter, your needs come first, and leading that conversation from then. So just validating that we also feel, and normalizing that we also have emotions, but also being transparent, and then learning from that and moving forward with the right key messages.
That's the biggest thing, is that we all make mistakes. We all, especially when we're emotionally involved and we care about someone and we care about their safety, we're not always going to get it right. Because sometimes our emotions cloud how we think we maybe should react in the situation. And I think owning that, and maybe even owning the impacts that that could have on someone, is a great first step. And apologizing. I think that's usually what any of us want when someone does get it wrong, even if they don't mean to, the impact is still there. So I think ownership is just, great place to start.
Definitely. And Mary, you mentioned something so important that kind of leads me to a different questions. You talked about the need for validating someone's experiences. So how can we build communities and systems that make it safer and more validating for survivors of intimate partner sexual violence so that they can speak up, or at least feel safe to do so?
Really great question. The start is to actively work on our own attitudes and beliefs, as well as our perceptions of what sexual violence could be. A really great start to creating safer and more validating communities and systems. I think I've mentioned this last time, but we all are being socialized differently. And one of our biggest socializers, especially in modern times, is media and social media, right? And the ways that media and social media depict sexual violence does not necessarily mirror the realities, but it does have a great impact on how people perceive sexual violence because we're heavily influenced by it. We literally go on social media or get exposed to media every single day of our lives, right?
Yeah.
So if an experience of sexual violence is different from what we have learned through that socialization process, we might minimize someone else's experience or even our own experience or completely disregard that because it doesn't meet our idea of what sexual violence should look like. And oftentimes, with regards to intimate partner sexual violence, it is not something that we always see a lot in media. And when we do, it is often romanticized, right? So we can start by challenging what we learn on media and social media about what sexual violence looks like and replace those misconceptions with facts. Then we can start building that society that recognizes that sexual violence can look differently for everyone who experiences it, and that it can happen to anyone and anywhere. And that unfortunately, it can also happen in places where we feel the safest and with people that we love and care about. And although that is a sad, sad fact, it is the reality of the situation, and spreading those facts can help normalize that sexual violence can also happen within those intimate relationships, and that can help in creating a more validating and safer society for people to share an experience of intimate partner sexual violence.
Absolutely. And the social media normalization and just media in generally normalizing these things is so, it goes unseen. It's so hidden. And I think that's how it normalizes it. I don't watch the series You. I tried a couple episodes and then it just, when you do heavy work, I think it's really heavy to watch those kinds of things. But I was reading this morning about how the series overall really normalized the violence of the lead character against women specifically, and how audience had responded kind of romanticizing the character in general, so much so that the actor was like, this is a problem, you're not supposed to like me. But
Mm-hmm.
it's, I don't know, it's interesting. Do you run into that sometimes when you're talking to people?
I think so.
I honestly find that people have referenced that show a lot, and I have watched that show myself, and I agree. Like you're sitting there and you like almost have this like initial response to like root for him because he's the protagonist. So you're like, and it's like, no, like that is weird, and it's very interesting. I mean, like you said, the actor, I think it's Penn Badgley, like really has been very honest about the fact like it wasn't what he thought. Like people are like really romanticizing him and almost like speaking to the fact that he's like a good partner. And it's like, no, he's not. And it's really interesting. And I think even one of the shows or movies, I guess, that got brought up in one of the trainings that I had done in the past was, I think it's called 365 Days, where the character kidnaps a woman and holds her captive for 365 days in order to, and said like, I'll let you go if you're not in love with me by like the end of the year. And that movie was really romanticized as well. I mean, the whole notion is like romanticizing a kidnapping essentially, but like a lot of folks were on social media again talking like, oh, I wish this happens to me, or like I hope this happens to me. And it's like, oh no. And again, when people are sharing these notions, there's not ill intent behind it, but we have to look at what that impact is.
Absolutely. And Hollywood does it because it's like the, if it bleeds, it leads, you're going to get attention.
Mhm.
And then
Yeah.
the unintended consequences are huge. To wrap our conversation up and kind of bring us back to that support service piece, for those listening who work in health, education, or social services, what's one thing they can do differently today to better recognize and support someone who may be experiencing sexual violence in a relationship?
One thing that they could do differently is really focusing on validating someone's experience and providing that support to an individual who is accessing it, and holding that space for them. Because I feel like when we don't understand and we cannot fully grasp a situation because it doesn't make sense in our head. Sometimes people fail to validate that experience because it does make sense in their head, right? But then when we just keep on validating that experience, it actually helps in normalizing intimate partner sexual violence in our society. And it reduces the stigma around it. So more people are talking about it, right? Which in turn helps the individual who was harmed make sense of their own experience. Because it helps normalize the emotions that the individual is feeling in that moment. A lot of times people might feel confused because it is someone that they love, someone that they care about that harmed them. And they might have that confusion within them because they did not like what was happening to them, right? But again, it goes back to that recognizing that two things can happen at the same time, that they might be in love with this individual, they might care for this individual, they might trust them even still, but that they don't like what was being done to them. They don't like the harm that they were experiencing. Just normalizing and validating that experience can really help individuals in their healing journey. So I think focus on the validation, not focusing on making sense of that experience.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both so much again for such a lovely conversation. I'm really excited to talk to you once more next week.
Thanks for joining us on the HerHealth Podcast, transforming health for women and girls at risk. Remember, your health matters, and together we can make a difference. Until next time, remember to prioritize your health and well-being. For more resources and support on issues affecting girls, women, and gender-diverse people, visit our website at avatraining.ca. This is Dr. Nicole Letourneau. Thank you for listening.